Well, Paddy just destroyed the intro. I had a very good intro, which Paddy just destroyed, so thanks, Paddy. But here it goes. So my presentation is a little bit different than everyone else's. It's less theoretical. It's more of a story of how I built this brand. And all of what I'm going to say is very applicable in your personal brand, your company's brand, or an outlet, if you so wish to build. My presentation is called How to Build a Media Outlet with No Money, No Journalists, No Original Content. On the 20th of October 2023, the Center for an Informed Public, an interdisciplinary research initiative of the University of Washington, one of the world's top universities, published a report, The New Elites of X, identifying the most influential accounts engaged in Hamas-Israel discourse. The report identified 7 accounts, which the researchers labeled the new elites. These 7 accounts, according to the report, exercised disproportionate power and influence over what audiences on Twitter, or X, as it's now called, read and watch. The report points out that these new elites drastically outperform traditional news sources, and the researchers concluded this report by warning that there are very rapid changes in media, changes that are happening in ways that they themselves, as researchers who've been studying these phenomena for years, do not fully understand. The report concluded that Twitter, or X, now operates, metaphorically at least, in the dark. That same day, an article appeared written by Brandy Zadrozny and was posted on NBC News, one of the most influential mainstream media outlets in the United States of America. The article covered the report and those 7 influential accounts, which were branded by researchers as new elites. Brandy, however, added a little bit of a twist. She put in the headline of her article that these accounts aren't informing, but they are warping the discourse and narrative. The article pointed out in a rather bitter tone that these 7 accounts outperform CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the BBC and Reuters, despite having drastically less followers than those mainstream media accounts. Across the first 3 days of the Hamas-Israel war, traditional media accounts generated 112 million views on Twitter. The 7 new elite accounts, 1.6 billion. That's 12 times more, of which visegard24 alone generated 370 million views. Over the next 3 weeks, visegard24 would go on to generate 1.2 billion impressions on Twitter alone. 3 days later, after the report and the article published, Brandy Zadrozny appeared on MSNBC's program American Voices, where Alicia Menendez, the host of the program, asked in a very concerned tone, Brandy, who's behind these accounts? To which Brandy answered, one of the answers included, a right-wing PR guy from Poland. That right-wing PR guy from Poland is me, and visegard24, currently the most influential account covering the Israel-Gaza war, is a profile that I built. So, welcome to my presentation, and this is how to build a media company with no money, no journalists, and no original content. Before I tell you how I did it, we have to start by defining the terms to understand what we're actually talking about. And the first question that we have is a very fundamental one. What is media? Media are the communication tools or outlets that store and distribute or deliver content. So that includes print, it includes publishing, broadcasting, radio, television, but also, of course, digital media. And one of the most common forms of content is news. And this begs the question, what is news? News is a very simple thing. At its most simple, it is information about current events. And who gathers and produces and packages that news? Journalists. These are the people who produce and distribute reports on the interactions of events, facts, ideas, and people that are the news of the day. And their role is to inform society about what is going on with some degree of accuracy. Journalists practice what we call journalism, and it has, of course, many different forms, from advocacy journalism to gonzo journalism, which was championed by Hunter S. Thompson, sadly no relation of mine, to investigative journalism, tabloid journalism, yellow journalism, war journalism, etc., etc., etc. Now, the press and the media have the explicit capacity of advocacy, and they have the implicit ability to frame political issues. This gives them power. Power, for example, to keep a government in check, which is why we call the media the fourth estate or the fourth power. Now, all of the definitions that I've provided you with and these kind of very basic intro levels concepts are all what journalism and media and news ought to be in a perfect world. And of course, we don't live in a perfect world. What has happened is that over the 20th century, media could be classified in 5 broad industries: print, recordings, cinema, radio, and television. Everything changed at the end of the 20th century when in 1990 the World Wide Web appeared, which at its most basic is essentially a network of networks. And then 10 years later, in the early 2000s, there was mass adoption of mobile phones, a way to distribute that news. Now, the 5 industries that are pointed out here have 2 characteristics that they all share. The first one is that they have very high barriers to entry. Essentially, it's very expensive to be part of them. It's expensive to produce a film. It's expensive to print a newspaper. It's expensive to run a radio station. The other thing is they're characterized by the fact that they're gatekeeped. So the barrier to entry is also physical. Not everyone can be a movie star. Not everyone can write an article and print it in the New York Times. There is a high level of gatekeeping. And that all disappeared with the appearance of digital media and the internet, which is this network of networks where all of that gatekeeping, both financial and connection-wise, suddenly completely disappeared. And this completely transformed news. That transformation was partially financial because it took a massive hit on the traditional media industry. So what happened is, to point that out to you just in one simple number, in 15 years since the mass adoption of the internet, newspaper publishing budgets in the United States of America went from $60 billion to just $20 billion, and that's despite massive inflation. So over 15 years, 1/3 of the money that was being spent on advertising in newspaper print outlets suddenly disappeared. And that was partially caused by the way we consume news. People are no longer buying newspapers because they're reading it online. And the internet did a second thing. It transformed, this is not necessarily a positive thing, by the way. In fact, none of the things I'm describing are necessarily positive, but they are events that are happening. The second thing that happened is that the internet transformed the way that we perceive the news. A 2022 Gallup poll found that only 7% of Americans have a great deal of trust in the media. Conversely, 66% of Americans had no trust or not very much confidence at all. And a 2023 Trust Barometer report by Edelman showed that journalists are amongst the least trusted professions in the world. The only other profession that is less trusted than a journalist, a politician. And I think that tells you all that you need to know. So in short, what we have a very, very broken media landscape. But that chaos, that disastrous landscape and situation of the media is also an opportunity that people like me have seized upon, and an opportunity that is still very much open and available to all of you. So, cracking on, how do you build a media outlet as I've described? This is the story of visegard24 and how we built it. The concept behind it was we were running a PR company with my brother and a friend of ours, a PR company with 12 employees that's doing fairly well, operating in the private sector. And one of the realizations that we had was that we often needed to place stories somewhere. We were spending a fair amount of money placing our stories that we were doing for clients in media outlets. And also we were fairly dissatisfied with the coverage that we were seeing in mainstream media of the niche topic that we were operating in. The solution was very simple. Why not build it ourselves? So in January of 2020, we set up visegard24, which was initially just a social media news aggregator. This was a complete side project, and this is how we did it. The first step was to build within a niche. Our niche was very simple. Our niche was Central and Eastern Europe, covered in English. And that's so Central and Eastern Europe being primarily Poland, Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary, and the countries around it. And this is a topic that didn't have extensive amounts of competition. So that's what we did. Essentially picked a niche that had very little competition in it and started building in it. The second aspect is you need to build a brand. The brand that we chose was visegard24. The reason we picked that was very simple. There was an existing geopolitical format called the Visegrad 4, so there was some recognition within a niche of experts, politicians, journalists, geopolitical strategists, researchers who understood that there was a concept called Visegrad 4. They were opinion makers who understood the idea, but the brand itself stood out because it's not an idea that's broadly known to the wider public. So we built upon an existing narrative of experts that we could lean into. The 24 obviously was borrowed from a large number of mainstream media outlets that run either programs that end with 24 or like France 24 literally called something with 24. The third part was finding content to produce. And at first, the idea was incredibly simple. We took mainstream media stories, big articles written by large media outlets, and condensed them. The idea is that no one really reads an article. How many of you have read an article in full length today about actual news? Most of us consume news by merely reading the headline. So we did exactly that. We took existing coverage and we simply repackaged it. We condensed articles into 3 short sentences, 1 Twitter or X post at a time. And this leads us on to something that Zach described very, very well in the previous presentation, and that is consistency. So we started it as a side project, and there's a rule that you probably all know, the 10,000-hour rule, which alleges that you need 10,000 hours to truly become a master in your discipline. There is another interesting rule called the 100-hour rule, which essentially suggests that all you need to be more proficient in a topic, a subject, or a discipline than 95% of people is 100 hours of your life. And that's exactly what we did. 100 hours over 1 year is 18 minutes. There were 3 of us. We put 18 minutes, so the length of this presentation, in a day, and we consistently posted. We found a formula, we stuck to it, and we kept to it, and we kept going. 18 minutes a day each. That was that. And to give you a description of the growth, by the end of, so we started with nothing in 2020. 100 hours later, by the end of 2020, we had 30,000 followers. By the end of 2021, 70,000 followers. By the end of 2022, 340,000 followers. And as of today, over 727,000 followers on Twitter alone. We have hundreds of thousands of followers on TikTok, on Instagram, on YouTube, on Telegram, on Facebook. Now, the fifth broad concept is doubling down on the momentum. The moment that we gained momentum in the side project, we doubled the time we were putting into it, we doubled our efforts, and we seized on the moment to essentially expand as it grew. So if you are producing content and it starts having traction, the best idea is then to essentially keep doing what you're doing. If it's generating views, similar content will keep generating views. And that's precisely what we did. Now, the sixth thing that we had, the big advantage that we had in comparison to massive traditional media, mainstream media, companies with millions of dollars on newsrooms, journalists, making original content, was that as a complete outsider, we were completely unbound by the rules of media. So we were able to play completely outside of the rules that traditional media coverage has. And this especially allowed us to seize on events such as the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia on the 24th of February 2022, where we were able to produce news at a much faster pace than traditional media because we weren't bound by the same rules. The same holds with the Hamas and Israel coverage. Now, both of these events, the coverage that we did of Ukraine, we did in cooperation with the Ministry of Interior of Ukraine. We collaborated very closely with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, and with the Hamas-Israel war, we're very, very closely cooperating with the IDF and the spokesperson of the IDF. We have sources within Israeli media that we're working very closely with. So we were very cautious to not produce misinformation. There was no, despite not playing within the traditional rules of the game, we were very, very concerned with having accurate, decent coverage. There was no sort of concept of spreading fake news in order to generate clicks. The clicks that we generated, 99.9% of our stories were accurate. We had to retract a few stories, some of which were fairly embarrassing. We accidentally, in 2022, posted a story claiming that Leonardo DiCaprio had donated $10 million to Ukraine. Turned out he hadn't. It was a fairly harmful piece of disinformation. And we got a story wrong where we claimed that Pornhub was blocked in Russia. Turned out, actually, Pornhub hadn't been blocked in Russia. So we had to retract that. But the bulk of what we were producing, despite being outside of these rules, was accurate. Now, the seventh step was evolving and essentially adapting the content. So we went from repackaging very basic information to then producing a swathe of other content as we gained an audience. From posting very simple things, such as simple beauty shots of the region, so very beautiful images of Central and Eastern Europe, but also providing quotes of famous people from politics, journalism, media, arts. And the other thing that we did, we found that what differentiated us from the traditional news sector was traditional news claims to be objective. I don't believe there is any objectivity in journalism. I think everyone has their implied biases. I think most newsrooms have a slant, they have an angle. They try and present themselves as unbiased, but it's something that is actually impossible to achieve. What we theorized was that actually, instead of being unbiased, we would provide news that was just the dry facts, but about a third to half of our content since then has been commenting the news. It turned out that audiences don't necessarily want the dry facts. People don't want to be told a fact without a slant, without a bias. So we started presenting our own biases, whether it would be, for example, around the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where we were very, very critical of the Russians, we were very aggressive towards Russia, and the commentary that we had and that we provided of the news let the viewer know, essentially making the decision for the audience. The same with the Israel and Hamas stories. Now, the mainstream media will sort of tell you a story, and that implicit bias is hidden. We took our biases and we used them as a strength. So we essentially provided a media outlet with a personality and a political view. It's a sort of crossover of traditional media and influencer media. Now, the eighth step was growing and raising money as we've become essentially a massive account that's generated, since we've started, roughly 8 billion impressions, of which 1.2 billion in the last months alone, and that's just on one platform. Essentially, the irony is that you cannot run a company with no money, no journalists, and no original content. It's not actually possible. You can build the basis of it, but you can't keep going in a meaningful way. So what we've done is we have raised the money, and we're now turning over 2024, we will turn it into a full-blown media operation with a desk room, journalists, an editor-in-chief, a think tank built aside to it, and a publishing house. And this is the ninth step is the next step, which is the great irony, is that having played outside the rules of traditional media, as we've grown and as we've built ourselves into something, we are now bound by the very rules that we've been breaking. As we've become relevant, as we've become the most influential account covering Hamas in Israel, we've now found ourselves in a situation where if we post information that turns out to be wrong, we could get someone killed. The BBC, the New York Times, the Washington Post all ran a story claiming that a Gazan hospital was hit by an Israeli missile strike. They published that based on information provided by Hamas and only Hamas. This led to worldwide protests across the world and led to embassies, the Israeli embassy, the British embassy, the American embassy across the Middle East being stormed, including in Turkey, in Syria, in Iraq. People almost died because the media got the story wrong. So suddenly, this is the great irony of the story, is that as we've gotten success breaking the rules that are enforced on media, we have ended up being beholden to them and understanding what they are and why they are in place. And the final point I have was the future of media. And I think this holds true to the accounts that you run for your businesses, the accounts that you run for your own personal accounts. I think all of what I said can be broadly adapted to a number of, to essentially anything you want. Visegard is going to be a news source that has been referenced in the last year alone by 10,000 articles in mainstream media. It's been used as a source, as a point of reference, or it's just been used in articles as a quoted tweet. And this has had a real impact, where our coverage of police brutality in the Netherlands led to an investigation by the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. Our reporting on the Finnish Prime Minister, who was busy partying during the NATO ascension of Finland, led to her government collapsing. There is real power in media, there is real power in having a platform, being able to tell a story, being able to disseminate information. And my ultimate reflection is this: I believe that the future of media, there will always be traditional media outlets. We will always need the Associated Press. We will always need the Polish press agency in Poland. We will always need the BBC. But the way that news is consumed, the way that stories are consumed, are essentially through outlets like visegard24 or citizen journalist-style influencers with a big audience that take these stories from mainstream media, repackage them with the implied and explicitly presented political angle of that influencer, of that outlet, and repackaged and served to an audience. There we are. That's my presentation.
Ladies and gentlemen,